The palace loomed at the edge of the dense forest, its towering spires bathed in the faint glow of the moon. Stories whispered through the village nearby spoke of a cursed TV hidden deep within the halls, a relic from the modern era that should never have belonged in such an ancient place. Anyone who dared to switch it on never lived to speak of what they saw. Seraphina stepped through the rusted gates, her boots crunching against the overgrown gravel path. She was no stranger to haunted tales. They were her passion and her livelihood. But there was something about this place, something oppressive. It felt as though the walls themselves were watching her. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" Kael asked, following close behind. His flashlight beam darted nervously across the crumbling walls. "This place screams bad idea." "Bad ideas make the best stories," Seraphina replied, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. "Besides, we're not here to scare ourselves. We're here to figure out why that TV is so infamous." Ardyn brought up the rear, a bag of tools slung over his shoulder. "I still think we should have brought backup," he muttered. "Not because of ghosts, but because this place might collapse on us." "Noted," Seraphina said, though her eyes remained fixed on the palace doors. She reached out and pushed them open with a groan that echoed through the grand hall. Dust hung heavy in the air, illuminated by their flashlights, and the faint scent of mildew clung to every surface. The palace was a masterpiece of forgotten opulence. Chandeliers dripped with cobwebs, and faded tapestries hinted at a grandeur long lost. But it wasn't the architecture that drew their attention. At the center of the hall, on a pedestal like some twisted trophy, stood the TV. It was old, boxy, with a cracked screen and knobs that looked like they hadn't been turned in decades. Yet, despite its decrepit appearance, it seemed alive. The air around it buzzed faintly, and Seraphina could almost swear she heard a low hum. "Yeah, this is it," she whispered, stepping closer. "Yeah, no thanks," Kael said, hanging back. "I'll stick to taking notes." "Let's see what's inside," Ardyn said, already pulling tools from his bag. "This thing's a relic. Could be something weird in the wiring." "Don't touch it yet," Seraphina warned, feeling a strange pull toward the TV. "Just let's see if it still works." Kael raised an eyebrow. "You want to turn it on? Isn't that how all these stories end?" "That's the point," she said, her fingers brushing the knob. The moment she turned it, the room seemed to shift. The hum intensified, and the static that filled the screen wasn't just random noise. It moved with purpose. Shapes flickered, barely visible, but enough to make Seraphina take a step back. "Do you see that?" she asked. "Yeah," Kael said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "And I wish I didn't." "I wish I didn't." The static began to coalesce into a figure, tall, shadowy, and featureless. It tilted its head as if observing them through the screen. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath visible in the freezing air. "Turn it off," Ardyn said, his voice trembling. "Turn it off now." But Seraphina couldn't move. The figure extended what looked like a hand, pressing it against the inside of the screen. A deep, guttural voice resonated, though no one could tell if it came from the TV or the room itself. "Why have you come?" it asked. Who are you?" Seraphina stammered, her heart pounding. "I am the gatekeeper," the figure replied, "and you have trespassed." The screen crackled, and suddenly the palace felt alive. Doors slammed in the distance, and the chandeliers began to sway violently. Kael grabbed Seraphina's arm, pulling her back, as Ardyn fumbled to shut off the TV. "It's not working," Ardyn yelled, twisting the knob futilely. The figure on the screen began to step forward, its form pressing against the glass as though it were trying to break free. The sound of static grew deafening, mingled with whispers in a language none of them could understand. "Run!" Kael shouted. The three of them bolted from the hall, the sound of shattering glass chasing them. Behind them, the TV screen exploded in a burst of light, and a scream, inhuman and filled with rage, echoed through the palace. They stopped in a side corridor, gasping for breath. The temperature had returned to normal, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. Seraphina looked at her friends, her face pale. "We need to find out what's going on here," she said. Kael shook his head. "Are you kidding me? We need to leave and never come back." "It's not just a story," Seraphina said, her voice trembling. "That thing, it's real, and if we don't stop it, who knows what it could do." Before anyone could argue, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hall, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. They weren't alone. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if the very palace were shifting under their weight. Seraphina, Kael, and Ardyn froze, their eyes darting toward the darkened hallway. The air around them grew thick, and an unnatural chill crawled up their spines. "Is it following us?" Ardyn whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own ragged breathing. "Does it matter?" Kael hissed. "We need to get out of here." "No," Seraphina said, her voice resolute despite the terror gripping her. "If we leave now, we'll never understand what's happening. We have to stop it." "Stop it? Stop what, exactly?" Kael snapped. "Did you see that thing? It's not human, Sarah." Before anyone could argue further, a guttural voice boomed through the corridor, deep and reverberating. "You cannot escape." The lights in the hallway flickered violently, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, a mass of shadow and static, its form barely holding together. It wasn't confined to the screen anymore. The three of them turned and ran deeper into the palace, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the labyrinthine halls. The oppressive presence followed, its static-filled whispers growing louder. "Upstairs!" Seraphina shouted, pointing toward a crumbling staircase. "Maybe we can lose it." They bounded up the steps two at a time, but the shadow was faster. It moved unnaturally, as though it were part of the very air around them. By the time they reached the top, the shadow was already creeping up the walls, enveloping the staircase behind them. "This way!" Ardyn yelled, leading them into a grand room that looked like a decayed library. Dusty shelves lined the walls, and the only light came from the fractured moonlight spilling through broken windows. The TV was there. It wasn't the same decrepit set they'd seen downstairs. This one was newer, sleek, and pristine, sitting on a polished wooden table as though it had been waiting for them. Its screen was off, but the hum it emitted was unmistakable. Kael's face twisted in panic. "Why is there another one? What is this place?" "It's not just a TV," Seraphina murmured, her eyes fixed on it. "It's a portal. That thing, it's using them to cross over." "So we destroy it," Ardyn said, pulling a crowbar from his bag. "We smash it to pieces." "Oh, wait!" Seraphina shouted, but it was too late. Ardyn swung the crowbar with all his strength, shattering the screen. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then the room exploded with sound. A cacophony of static, screams, and guttural growls. The shattered TV sparked and sputtered, but instead of falling silent, it began to pulse with light. The static-filled shadow that had been chasing them burst into the room, its form growing larger, more defined. "You've made a grave mistake," it snarled, its voice no longer a whisper, but a roar. The shadow lunged for Ardyn, wrapping around him like a living shroud. He screamed, thrashing wildly, but the shadow seeped into his body, his movements slowing until he went rigid. His eyes snapped open, filled with flickering static. "Ardyn!" Seraphina cried, but he didn't respond. He turned toward her, his face contorted into a grotesque smile, and began to advance. "It's controlling him," Kael said, backing away. "We have to get out of here." Seraphina shook her head. "No, this ends now." She ran to the TV, ignoring the sparks flying from its broken screen. She could feel the pull of the portal, a force so strong it threatened to consume her. She grabbed a nearby bookend, heavy and solid, and slammed it into the base of the TV. The light from the TV intensified, blinding and searing. The shadow screamed, a sound that shook the very foundations of the palace. Ardyn collapsed to the floor, motionless, as the shadow writhed, unable to maintain its form. "It's working," Kael shouted. "Keep going." But as Seraphina raised the bookend for another strike, the shadow surged toward her, enveloping her completely. She gasped as the cold, suffocating darkness filled her senses. "Seraphina!" Kael shouted, but she was gone, her body crumpling to the floor. The TV pulsed one last time, then exploded in a burst of energy, sending Kael flying against the wall. When he came to, the room was silent. The shadow was gone, and the TV lay in smoldering ruins. In the seconds, Kael crawled to Seraphina's body, shaking her. "Sarah, wake up, please!" But she didn't move. Behind him, the faint hum returned. Kael turned, his heart sinking. The shards of the shattered TV were reassembling themselves, the screen knitting back together as if time were reversing. The static returned, stronger than ever, and a new figure appeared on the screen. It was Seraphina. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her expression twisted in agony. "Run!" she whispered, her voice distorted by static. "You can't stop it." The screen flickered, and Seraphina's face was replaced by the shadow, grinning. Kael staggered to his feet, his mind screaming at him to flee. But as he turned to leave, the doors slammed shut. The palace groaned, and the hum of the TV grew deafening. He was trapped. The next morning, the villagers found the palace silent once more. The doors were sealed, and the rumors began anew, of the cursed TV, of those who dared to challenge it, and of the screams that echoed through the halls long after midnight. No one ever saw Seraphina, Kael, or Ardyn again, but on stormy nights, when the wind howled and the lightning flashed, some claimed they could see the flicker of static through the palace windows. The TV was always watching.